Good morning, everyone. Good morning. It's time, and you are all warmly welcome to today's seminar to be held by Christiaan de Beukelaer on the topic, One Planet Shipping, Can Maritime Transport Deliver Climate Justice? With a question mark. We have the pleasure of having Christiaan here as a Global Horizons Senior Fellow for the year. And when he's not here, he's Senior Lecturer in Culture and Climate at the University of Melbourne. And Christiaan describes himself as a political anthropologist working on power and ideology in global governance. Originally trained as a musicologist at the University of Amsterdam, his interest turned to understanding how governments and international organizations began to frame music industries as drivers of development. And after working with cultural policy for a decade, he now focuses mainly on maritime transport and climate policy. The common thread in his research is an attempt to understand how global governance can be both so dysfunctional and so important for climate justice. And he does so by using his interdisciplinary training, which provides him with a unique outlook. I have to quote one thing that I remember from his application to SCAS, and I quote him here: "I'm principally interdisciplinary." His latest book, Trade Winds, A Voyage to a Sustainable Future for Shipping, is this one. It's in our library to read if you're interested, was published in 2023, and it recounts his 5 months aboard the century-old schooner Aventure during the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the travelogue provides a backdrop to his discussion of the environmental impacts of the shipping industry and the potential of wind propulsion. And upon its publication, the Financial Times described it as a, I quote, notable book on climate and the environment. He's also published a number of articles in journals like Climate Policy, Marine Policy, Cultural Studies, Journal of African Cultural Studies, and others. And he's also been visiting universities and institutes for advanced study, for example, the Aix-Marseille University and the Durham University and its Institute for Advanced Study. Christiaan is also a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, a technical advisor to the Micronesian Center for Sustainable Transport, and an external member of the Institute for Environment, Conservation and Sustainability at the University of Toronto. Here at SCAS, he works on the project Shipping the Future, Maritime Cargo Transport for a Livable Planet. Most welcome, Christiaan.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, everyone else, for joining, both here in person and online. I want to start with a bit of history. On the 8th of May in 1621, the Dutch Vrije Oost-Indische Compagnie, or the East India Company, under the so-called leadership of Jan Pieterszoon Koen, instigated a deliberate massacre of the entire population of the Banda Islands in present-day Indonesia. Why? Because the Dutch wanted to establish a global monopoly in the nutmeg trade. I'm not going to recount the full history of that massacre here, because Amitav Ghosh has done that in his recent book, The Nutmeg's Curse. But I do start with this horrible event to make it clear that the ship is the technology that made colonialism and empire possible. Maritime transport forms a critical node in the infrastructure that enables the extraction and exploitation of resources, energy, and labor. And the shipping industry, then as today, has never been a neutral servant of global trade, as people in the shipping industry like to call it. In short, shipping has shaped the world as we know it. And today I want to argue, and hopefully with some success, that shipping could also serve as a lever to deliver climate justice, hopefully in both senses of the word. The way I want to tackle that somewhat large subject today is through 5 short chapters. And first, I ask the, deceptively simple question, where are we headed? And currently, we live on borrowed planetary resources. And it's a credit that we're unlikely to ever pay back, not least because the cumulative impact of planetary overshoot is getting bigger and bigger. And future generations are footing the bill for that, despite ostensible attempts to tackle this issue. Last year, August 1st, marked Earth Overshoot Day on a planetary level. And while some countries do not or did not overshoot their fair share of planetary resources, others overshot theirs much sooner. In some cases, as early as February 11th for Qatar or February 20th for Luxembourg. Sweden overshot its fair share on April 21st, and thereby doing well worse than the global average. In 2025, Singapore will most likely have used up its fair share tomorrow, and Israel will follow in 2 weeks. The great acceleration that you see here that happened throughout the 20th century happened to coincide with the invention of the shipping container. And that container, that piece of technology, transformed the shipping industry and made the import of goods and the export of environmental impacts easier, cheaper, and faster. In doing so, maritime transport has enabled a minority of the world's population to increase its energy and materials use, while the majority is left behind, having to deal with the environmental backlash. Faced with growing concerns about the geophysical limits of the planet, researchers at the Stockholm Resilience Center led efforts to quantify the planetary boundaries that we collectively face. And they identified 9 of them. In 2009, when they first published on this, they were able to assess 7 of those 9, and we had crossed 3 of them. 6 years later, we had crossed 1 more. And 2 years ago, of all the 9 boundaries that they assessed, we had crossed 6. I'm not going to argue that shipping or maritime transport caused this, but it really has helped create a global economy that exacerbates the geographic and social inequalities concealed by this very planetary view. Because as we've seen, the share of this burden is not equal to all countries or people. And in response to the crossing of these planetary boundaries, Johan Rockström and his colleagues at the Stockholm Resilience Center recently called for a new paradigm to safeguard those Earth-regulating systems. And they do so by proposing to designate the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the biosphere, the lithosphere, and the cryosphere as planetary commons. And that's easier said than done because that effectively includes everything, if you read between the lines. Especially since the environmental pressures on the planetary commons are not equally shared. That makes it so difficult to tackle this and to treat them as commons. And this is why the geographer Laurie Parsons speaks of carbon colonialism, and the economic anthropologist Jason Hickel speaks of atmospheric appropriation. So what does that look like, that inequality? In very crude terms, this is what it looks like. The richest 10% are responsible for 50% of consumption-based carbon emissions. And if you earn more than about 180,000 Swedish kroner a year, that 10% includes you as well. You will, however, notice that I blend a focus on planetary boundaries, carbon dioxide emissions, Earth overshoot, Earth system boundaries, and later on also material footprint. And these are obviously not the same things. They are actually quite different. But they do all illustrate a very important trend. And that is that on a planetary level, we are overshooting boundaries, and that responsibility is not shared equally. So, to kind of shift the conversation somewhat to a more positive direction, what I'm using as a normative horizon as part of this project is this idea of doughnut economics that was developed by Kate Raworth. And this model obviously isn't perfect, but it does two important things. It stresses that societies need to ensure livelihoods above social foundations, the inner circle of the doughnut, while doing that below the environmental ceilings of the planet, the outer circle. And all that to ensure good and meaningful lives within that narrow space of a safe and just space for humanity. So this really brings me back to the planetary perspective of my work. And I want to ask, what kind of shipping industry is commensurate with a livable planet? And what, and how, or if shipping could be a lever for climate justice through the trade it enables? But before we turn to these questions, I want to highlight what is actually happening within the industry. And that brings us to the suits. Because it's probably important to take a bit of a look at what the shipping industry looks like and what is happening there, or what has happened there over the past 10 years in terms of environmental regulation. Now, international cargo ships transport 12 billion tons of goods every year. That adds up to more than 60 trillion ton miles, so 1 ton over 1 mile, if you add it all up. And to do so, these ships burn 300 million tons of fossil fuels every year, mostly extremely toxic blends, the residual, the leftovers of refinery processes, namely heavy fuel oil, or since 2020, a slightly less sulfurous blend called very low sulfur fuel oil. And combined, the burning of this 300 million tons of fossil fuels generates about 1 billion tons of greenhouse gases every single year. And that's about 3% of global emissions, which is more than all of Germany. So who's regulating this? Well, the regulatory body is the International Maritime Organization, founded in 1948, and that body has a so-called Marine Environment Protection Committee. And that committee is meant to respond to the calls for the IMO to regulate shipping emissions, as was included in the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 and the Paris Agreement in 2015. More recently, also the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea issued an advisory opinion that made it very clear that greenhouse gas emissions, not only those happening at sea, but all greenhouse gas emissions constitute marine pollution, because the air renders the ocean more acidic. And that gives all the signatories to the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea an obligation to tackle greenhouse gas emissions, not only at sea, but also on land. The IMO adopted an initial strategy in 2018, which was not very ambitious. To put it very simply, it set a target to have emissions between 2008 and 2050, which would bring them back to the emissions levels of 1990, which was the baseline for the Kyoto Protocol, which already asked the IMO to take action, to give you an idea of how limited that ambition was. In July 23, the IMO unanimously adopted a revised strategy to phase out greenhouse gas emissions from shipping entirely by 2050 and have intermediate goals of 20 to 30% reduction by 2030 and 70 to 80% by 2040. And that is really significant because if you have even a slight increase of 2-3% of shipping volumes, that means that the emissions per vessel need to come down a lot more. The good news is that these targets are currently being translated in what will be legally binding measures. And these measures will include a fuel standard that indicate how much emissions a unit of energy can emit, but also a pricing mechanism. And that pricing mechanism is something that is very contentious because some countries really don't want that at all, and others want a universal levy of up to $150 per ton of CO2 emitted. I am hoping, personally, that that levy will come through at least that level. Not only because it's necessary to drive the energy transition, but also because it would send a very clear signal that we can actually regulate climate action in a very decisive way, which so far, let's be honest, we haven't been able to do, especially not at a global level. So if adopted, that levy would be the first ever legally binding universal price on emissions for an entire industry. The bad news, however, is that the 1.5 degree limit that is so important for much of the world is probably already gone. Last year, we had 1.6 degrees of warming above pre-industrial averages. And of course, you need a longer period to actually broach that limit. But effectively, we're coming dangerously close to hitting higher temperatures towards or even above 2 degrees by mid-century. But let's keep the focus somewhat positive. There is an increasing group of countries, more than 50 at the moment, that support this kind of a levy on shipping emissions. And they, as countries, represent 66% of the global shipping fleet through the shipping registries that they run. Also the European Commission and the International Chamber of Shipping, which, as an industry lobby group, represents 80% of the entire global fleet, are behind this proposal. I'll come back to this later, but this initiative was spearheaded by a group of Pacific Island states and not by the EU, as you might think. But you might also be inclined to think that given this level of support, including from the major shipping industry newspaper, that this levy is a done deal. But that's absolutely not the case. Because this document that I don't have and you have not seen is circulating where certain countries who have blocked the adoption of such a levy are becoming more and more vocal in their opposition. So who are these countries that oppose such a levy? It's mostly BRICS and petrostates. So with petrostates, I mean OPEC countries, minus Nigeria, because they're actually in favor of a levy like this, but plus the United States, Norway, and Australia. I group them under the petrostates because they are. But this group that is quite vocal, or that really blocks the adoption of a levy at least, they represent, and this is a very important point, they represent or spend 68% of the $7 trillion that is spent in fossil fuel subsidies every single year. So they spend nearly $5 trillion on fossil fuel subsidies, with China head and shoulders above everyone else at $2.2 trillion every single year. I have a discussion paper outlining the challenge between those two country groups that's coming out later this week or early next week, but more about that later. So the problem, though, with this particular approach is that we're actually framing a very complex issue that isn't only about climate, but is really about trade. It's about how people can live, how people use materials, and how they have access to goods, energy, and so on. We're reducing that to, something very simple. 1.5 degrees of warming, a certain, concentration of carbon dioxide particles in the atmosphere, or, net zero, or something that is really quite simple. But from a planetary boundary and social well-being perspective, the issue is really a lot more complex. And that complexity is incredibly difficult to address at the IMO in London. So I'm not going to say that this is the only thing that's happening at the IMO, but it's the key thing. There is one element that adds to this real pressure to bring down greenhouse gas emissions, and that is the call for a just and equitable transition. And this, once again, is spearheaded by a group of Pacific Island states under the leadership of the Marshall Islands, which has played an outsized and leading role in pushing for climate action in the shipping industry. And it's quite important to sketch a little bit of context, because there are some contradictions at play here. Because it's a fairly recently, independent country that consists of 29 atolls and 5 islands that house a population of only 43,000 people in the latest census. Their elevation above sea level is very, very low, at a maximum of 2 meters. And at high tide, it's a lot less than that. And at king tides, it's negative. But the Marshall Islands also houses the 3rd largest shipping registry in the world. And they have a compact of free association with the United States, a part of which is their leasing of one of the atolls, or part of the atolls, to the US military, where they house the Ronald Reagan Ballistic Missile Defense Test Site on Kwajalein. So there's some interesting contradictions here in terms of what position this country takes in this environment. But the Marshall Islands, together with the Solomon Islands, Fiji, Tuvalu, Tonga, and Kiribati, created a group of like-minded countries, nicknamed the Six-Pack, that pushed for 3 critical things: a transition in shipping in line with a 1.5 degree future, a universal levy on these emissions, and an equitable transition. And I want to get back to that equitable transition a bit more. I want to unpack that a little bit more. It's interesting to see also that since I started working with the Marshall Islands as a technical advisor, countries like Nauru, Vanuatu, Palau, Samoa, but also countries from outside of the Pacific region, including Belize and many other Caribbean countries, and Seychelles in the Indian Ocean, joined this coalition. So what does that just and equitable transition really look like? The key thing to always remember is that having a price on these emissions is primarily to ensure that ship owners have real clarity, that they know fossil fuels are right now or will become a lot more expensive. There is clarity to just adjust the fuel cost on their spreadsheets and make the calculation of when and how and what kind of technology they should be investing in to stop paying this, what is effectively a surcharge on polluting fuels. And a part of that encouragement is to effectively recycle some of the funds. So there's a levy that you pay, there is a penalty that you pay if your emissions are above the fuel standard, but if you have an over-compliant ship, particularly a zero-emission ship that uses technology that is viable in the long term, then that comes with a reward to actually offset both the capital and operational expenditure of that vessel. But that's not the only thing. The levy that would be needed to subsidize these fuels is much lower than what is needed to really make it crystal clear to the industry that fossil fuels are a dead end. So with the gap, a lot of revenues are raised that can then be used to effectively address the climate damages and the impacts both within the broader shipping industry and environment, but also beyond that for particularly climate vulnerable countries. And considering that shipping uses up around 3% or contributes to about 3% of emissions, it would be fair that shipping also contributes about 3% to climate finance. That is my personal view, at least. And research has shown that for developing countries alone, the cost or the amount of climate finance needed is at least $2.4 trillion a year. As a reminder, that's about the same as what China spends on direct and indirect fossil fuel subsidies. But let's say that shipping makes a proportionate contribution to that. That would translate to $72 billion a year. And the levy that's on the table would raise something between something around 100 a year. So depending on exactly how high the levy is and how fast the transition goes, this would actually go a long way to both subsidizing the actual transition and covering additional climate finance needs. And it's important, though, to remember that we do not depart from a situation that is just and equitable when we're speaking about a just and equitable transition. And UNCTAD, the Geneva-based UN agency, publishes this review of maritime transport every year and has done so since 1968. And they tell us year after year that least developed countries and small island developing states pay higher than average transport costs for much smaller volumes and actually don't have enough to live decent lives. They also suffer a lot more from the climate crisis than the rich countries that caused it. And even so, they don't have the funds to invest in their own shipping transition or climate transition more broadly. So they're stuck in a bit of a double bind. They can't afford to take action, but they can't also afford not to take action. And this is what that just an equitable energy transition is meant to resolve. Particularly because transport costs will increase no matter which set of measures is adopted. If measures will be effective in reducing emissions, the costs of shipping will go up. So how do you compensate for that? What is on the table in terms of a just and equitable transition is critical, but it's insufficient. Because it overlooks some really critical questions in terms of what the shipping industry is actually doing. Who benefits? Who controls the industry? What kind of trade does it enable? What couldn't travel without any ships like this? And what is the actual purpose of maritime transport? And that really brings us to, or that opens up the normative horizons that I want to focus on. And with these normative horizons, I want to quickly come back to this country overshoot. Because we collectively overshoot planetary boundaries, but the undershooting countries are not listed here. And they're definitely not celebrated in this environment. But by not listing them, this kind of a graph really obscures the collective nature of that overshoot, or the inequalities that are, hidden in the idea that this is something of a planetary issue. And if you look at these two country profiles, you'll see that the country on your left transgresses the biophysical boundaries of the planet without even meeting all the social thresholds of its population. Whereas the country on your right does not overshoot any of the biophysical boundaries, but has real issues in meeting the social needs of its population. In short, overdeveloped countries like the US on your left import goods and export environmental impacts, both directly and indirectly. Whereas so-called underdeveloped countries like Sri Lanka on your right, they export goods and they import directly or indirectly environmental pollution. But what is quite tricky about this particular depiction is that it's not clear just how much countries like the US or Sweden or Belgium or Australia, it doesn't really matter, how much they overshoot their planetary boundaries. It kind of just has this dotted line suggesting it's a lot, but we're not going to quantify exactly how much. But neither does it give us a really good sense of what living within that doughnut, within those boundaries, would actually look like. But before we get into that, it's important to answer a very simple question. Is it possible on a planetary level to ensure a good life for everyone within these planetary boundaries? Research suggests it is, at least in theory, with some very major structural adjustments, particularly towards away from rich countries. And that's good news, because otherwise we'd end up in some sort of Malthusian situation, which is neither helpful nor, it's not helpful. Let's put it there. So it is possible, but it really does require a very significant shift away from the current trajectories that we use to think about climate change and environmental pressures. So what would that look like in practice? So here I'm shifting to the material footprint of economies, which again is a different concept, but it's part of a similar trend. And what you see is that Johan Velez Hanao and Stefan Pauliuk suggest that we can attain decent living standards within, by using something between 3 and 14 tons of materials per person every year. So that's everything that we consume, from food, the resources for buildings, the infrastructure. Everything needs to kind of be contained in that amount. And you see here some of the calculations that they use to get to that, but I'll leave you to read that. But what they highlight is that we can live, minimally decent lifestyles with about 3 tons per person a year, or a bit more generous ones with 14 tons a year per person. But that's quite a lot less from what most countries actually, put through their economic metabolism. Because China is, above 35 tons per person. Germany is at 72, and the US is somewhere there around 85, inching towards 90. Even so, the average material footprint of a human being is about 12.5 tons a year. And yet, the International Resource Panel that keeps all the data on this has suggested that the maximum that we should keep as a guide rail is 6 to 8 tons per person. And this is a bit of a challenge because we're on some sort of a perpetual growth trajectory where we've managed to, at least to some extent, generate a relative decoupling between GDP growth and carbon dioxide emissions. So the economy grows, and so do carbon emissions. They just don't grow quite as fast. But what you see is that the material footprint of the global economy does continue to grow in lockstep with economic growth. And that's quite a bit of an issue if you look at it historically. Because in 1820, the total tonnage transported was 20 million tons. In 2023, it was 12 billion tons. That's 600 times more. In the same period, the global population increased from 1 to 8 billion people, making the increase in cargo transport 75 times higher than the increase in population. 75. So that really creates a bit of a challenge because despite that massive increase of cargo transport per capita and resource use per capita, it hasn't really quite delivered decent living standards for all. And this is where, I mean, anyone who's following conversations or thinking about shipping will raise some questions around that 100 billion tons that I'm referring. Because there's this myth in the shipping industry that cargo ships transport 90% of everything we consume. And more detailed reports usually have it at around 80% and around 70% by value. But basically, 80 to 90% of what we consume is meant to be shipped. But that can't be right. If we have, on the one hand, we have 100 billion tons of material footprint, 12.5 tons per person, and at the same time, you have a shipping industry that transports 12 billion tons, or 1.5 ton per person, and that is meant to be 90% of everything. And this is when Phil Steinberg and myself started looking into that discrepancy and, trying to understand how we could have such different numbers in that same space. And no one in shipping speaks about the 100 billion tons, but everyone likes to say 80 to 90% shipping is so important. And shipping is important in the context of international trade. But the vast majority of the resources that we use are not traded internationally. And for anyone who works on shipping, I'll just highlight a few key things. Agricultural production alone is 9.6 billion tons a year. Cement production is 4.3 billion tons a year. And fossil fuels alone add up to nearly 14 billion tons of these fuels, whether it's coal, oil, or gas. So that really shows that we do consume collectively an awful lot more than what we're led to believe if we simply look at maritime international transport. And what is interesting is that some solutions are really quite easy. So if you want to reduce the material footprint, if you want to reduce our reliance on maritime transport, then it's very easy to look at this graph from the International Energy Agency. They say one single large container ship of solar panels can provide the same energy as 50 large LNG tankers or 100 large coal ships. So that's quite significant. If you have that energy transition, you can transport an awful lot less, but you also have a much lower material footprint. But Of course, not all solutions are this easy, and even if this example is instructive, and not all shipping is necessary either, because you often have, these examples of, you catch shrimp off Scotland and you send it to Vietnam or China to get it peeled, and then you ship it back, so it ends up in British supermarkets. So you can also think about that relation between the materials that we use and how we're transporting it and what kind of role it plays. Because in that context, it's simply exploiting a wage differential. And that's the only thing it does. Shipping is cheaper, or the cost of shipping is so low that it doesn't really make a difference when you're trying to exploit that difference in wages between Asia or Southeast Asia and Scotland. But how can we start thinking about this kind of a question, not just for solar panels or for shrimp, but for an economy as a whole? And can maritime transport really deliver climate justice? To answer that question, we kind of have to go back a little bit in history, because we have to understand that it would require quite a different outlook on the political economy of both trade and planetary resources. So if we go back to the early 17th century, so about 20 years before the Banda massacre happened, we find a book published by Hugo de Groot, or Grotius, called Mare Liberum. And this book was plain and simple a defense of so-called free trade at sea. His argument was, trading ships don't harm anyone, so they shouldn't be harmed by, competing powers. It was effectively an attempt of the Dutch to establish a certain kind of innocent passage, if you will, across the seas for trading ships against the Portuguese and the Spanish, who wanted to own the ocean and restrict traffic across them. So the free trade that Grotius is proposing or defending here at that time effectively meant colonial exploitation by force of violence. And while colonialism itself is meant to have ended, the legal principles promoted by Grotius continue to inform maritime and international law. Needless to say, that legal regime is not set up to deliver justice of any kind. That was never the objective. But that legal and international and maritime regime has facilitated a massively growing economy at an unacceptable environmental cost. So if we return to this doughnut as a proxy for decent living standards without an unacceptable environmental cost, then what does that say about possible trajectories? The space that you have within the doughnut corresponds to the green rectangle in the bottom right corner. The data used across these two depictions is slightly different, but the principle is the same. And it's a normative target. And what's interesting is that none of the countries depicted here by these colorful dots are actually within that space. But they are spread across the other three quadrants of, this graph. And the NGO Circle Economy, which also calculates how much of the global economy is currently circular, which, by the way, we're actually regressing. The last report indicated that it's less circular than the year before, which is not very encouraging. But they have drawn up a classification of 3 country groups to illustrate how different the trajectories are. And build countries, which are listed here as, in the bottom, Built countries live within planetary boundaries, but still need to build an economic system that satisfies their society's basic needs. They're home to 46% of the global population. They currently transgress few, if any, planetary boundaries, but they struggle to meet their basic needs, such as education and healthcare, and therefore score low on Human Development Index indicators. Their economies are dominated by agriculture and forestry, and they are building basic infrastructures. The build profile is most relevant to countries in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asian countries, and some small island states. The larger countries by population to which this profile may apply are India, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Pakistan, and the Philippines. The largely middle-income grow countries need to continue growing in a way that satisfies their societal needs, but within planetary boundaries. They're home to about 37% of the world's population and are industrializing rapidly and building infrastructure to lift their populations out of poverty and accommodate a growing middle class. They are global manufacturing hubs and the world's largest agricultural producers. They use about 51% of materials and generate 41% of emissions. And countries, representative of this group are China, Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, Vietnam, Myanmar, Egypt, and so on. Shift countries, on the other hand, need to shift away from over-consuming the planet's materials in servicing their relatively affluent and comfortable lifestyles. Though it's important to point out that inequalities within shift countries are rife. They're home to a minority of the world's population, about 17%, but consume 31% of materials and generate 43% of emissions. Per capita, shift countries are the largest consumers across all material groups. Their extraction of fossil fuels is relatively high, as is their participation in global trade. So they have high Human Development Index scores, but do so through overconsumption, which needs to be limited in order to bring these countries within planetary boundaries. And some countries that include, this group are the US, Japan, Australia, Canada, Argentina, and EU member states. So, right now, the problem with this constellation is that to a great extent, or to the greatest extent, climate justice is a mirage. Because either you're rich and you overshoot the planet's carrying capacity, some needing the equivalent of 6 planets in resources to maintain their lifestyles, or you keep within planetary boundaries while remaining poor, failing to deliver basic health, housing, and education to their populations. And grow countries are stuck in some sort of a Faustian pact between them. Obviously, none of these options is acceptable because it puts us on a trajectory that is wholly destructive. And this should be what climate justice could look like, is pursuing these vastly different trajectories that actually take into account both the historical emissions, but also the fact that the ways in which countries currently operate within that global trading system are not morally defensible or acceptable. So shift countries need to do less with a lot less. Build countries need to do a lot more with a little bit less. And build countries, that was grow countries, and build countries need to do a lot more with about the same. And acting on this requires some really difficult conversations around how we ship things, which is happening at the IMO, but also what we are shipping, where it is shipped, and why it is transported in the first place. And that's not very easy to do in a sector that continuously claims to be a mere servant of trade, responding to flows in the global economy that, in that logic, are primarily abstract, and they respond to these abstract flows by delivering the actual goods, rather than accepting that as an industry it enables what then becomes abstract flows. Because they do and have always shaped the kind of global trade that we see. And those conversations are very difficult if you remember that this industry continues to operate within a legal regime that was established to facilitate colonial exploitation. So in other words, we need to tackle climate justice in a forum like the International Maritime Organization, but certainly not only there. The same logic applies to other fora, in which questioning the political economy of global trade is taboo. And that makes it pretty much impossible to attain climate justice. But it forces us, at the same time, to be a lot more ambitious in the visions that we craft for the future. Which, as I was preparing this, and as I've kind of gone through a lot of the data and kind of ideas and principles around the frameworks that I've used, led me to a very simple question. Can we really reduce our best imaginable future to a doughnut? Thank you. And before you go, I want to actually say like a proper thank you, because there are quite a few people that I've listed here, and this is not the kind of work that one does in isolation, and it has required very significant and extensive collaboration and dialogue. And I would like to genuinely thank everyone who I've listed here and who's been involved in the work that I've done. And that includes also everyone that I've forgotten to list, just as a disclaimer. But thank you, genuinely everyone here on this list and elsewhere. Thank you.